Good afternoon, everyone. We'll get started in just 1 second. We are letting there's a bunch of people entering the room, so we'll get started in 1 second. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Jurch, and I'm the Associate Vice President of the Center for Policy and Practice at the Association of Community College Trustees. Thank you for joining us for this discussion today to talk about a topic that has been on the minds of community colleges and states for some time now, Workforce Pell. Before we get started, I want to take care of a couple of housekeeping items. We are recording this session, and the recording will be sent to the registrants as well as posted on our website. We will be monitoring the Q&A function, so if you would like to ask a question, please use that. We will have time for questions and answers at the end, but we'll be answering them live during the session if possible. States have been working hard, putting together stakeholder teams to help sort through the regulations, designing processes around eligibility, workforce alignment, data concerns, and implementation considerations to be ready when Workforce Pell goes into effect on July 1. There's a lot of information swirling out there, and we want to help provide some clarity around what state leaders want colleges to know. I'm fortunate to be joined today by Annie Phillips from the Education Strategy Group, who is here to talk with 3 state leaders who will share their insights on the why behind their state policy approaches, share key implementation considerations, and offer their perspective on how to make the most of this opportunity. Annie, thank you so much for being here, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, and thank you for being a great partner to ESG. Everyone, my name is Annie Phillips. I'm a director at Education Strategy Group. If you're not familiar with ESG, we're a mission-driven consulting firm focused on ensuring education delivers on its promise of economic mobility. For the last several months, I have been living and breathing Workforce Pell and been working alongside 8 states to grapple with Workforce Pell implementation. This is everything from facilitating interagency groups to technical advising, technical analyses, stakeholder engagement. And look, there's a lot more that I think is explicitly known about Workforce Pell today than even a month ago, right? We've got the final rules out. States are starting to release their policies for Workforce Pell as of our last count this morning with our team. That is 12 states that are moving towards that. And so as Steve and I were chatting, we were like, man, we now is the time, right, for institutions to really dig in because I think there's going to be less swirl about what Workforce Pell actually is. So, to get us started, I'm actually going to share just a couple of slides real quick because ultimately the real show are our excellent panelists that we have here to give a little bit more on just like, hey, what's Workforce Pell if you're not living and breathing it every day like we are. Our team likes to break this down into 3 major components: the program requirements, so that's going to be your length requirements. I'm not going to read all these. You're making sure that it's aligned with a high skill, high wage, or in demand job, meets the hiring requirements of employers. I do want to call out this last bullet here because there's been a little tweak in the final rules of no more than 25% of training provided via written arrangement, essentially ineligible providers. We got stackability requirements here. The program must lead to an industry recognized credential that is stackable and portable. It's got to provide credit that articulates to 1 or more additional certificates or degrees. And then finally, the outcomes requirements. And I know we're all scratching our head about how are we going to get this data and what's it going to look like. But you've got to have a verified, it is what it is, right? It was in the statute, a verified completion rate of 70% and a verified job placement rate of 70%. And then finally, the program has to meet an earnings requirement, which is essentially like a return on investment. It takes into account cost and then median earnings against the federal poverty level. So that's probably old news for most of you. What maybe you haven't spent as much time with is the state's new authority in sort of determining eligibility. So again, our team likes to break this down in kind of 3 main categories. The first is of those eligibility requirements I just named, states have to actually determine, kind of define some of these. Importantly, they are the priority occupations to which Workforce Pell programs must align. So that's everything from like, how are we defining high wage to the actual occupations that align with them. The second, employer validation. This gets to those hiring requirement pieces. They need a policy on stackability and portability, and then a policy too on program to credit articulation. How are institutions and programs themselves going to show evidence towards those things? They must also detail the program approval process. So things that we have seen in our partners are, right, of course, what does the actual application look like, the timeline for approvals, the review process, who has the authority, and we're going to talk a little bit about which entities actually get that authority, data validation, appeals, right? There's a lot that goes into this. And then finally, the state will play a role in ongoing compliance and monitoring, validating those completion and placement metrics every year. So programs will go through a re-review process, important to note for providers. And then that priority occupations list will be updated biannually. A lot going on here. As it relates, again, something you may have been watching closely, maybe not, are sort of what things change in the NPRM and final rules. So what I just named about states' authority, that has stayed the same from, frankly, all the way going back to the white paper that came out in December on this. But big things that have shifted in the final rules. One, I mentioned that 25% ceiling on a program's instruction that can be delivered by an ineligible third-party provider. That's staying the same for standard, your standard everyday programs, but they have allowed an exclusion for the related technical instruction that is a part of a registered apprenticeship. That sort of outsourced instruction can be between 25 to 49%. It was basically an acknowledgement that employers are often the ones providing on-the-job training and trying to provide a little bit more flexibility for registered apprenticeship programs to be eligible. The second that I think is really important is that stacking student inclusion is that stacking students are excluded from value added earnings measurements. So this is a win for those who looked at the statute and said this isn't just about job placement, but pathway progression as well. In the NPRM, basically, they weren't necessarily like specifying, but they had a pretty standard calculation for value added earnings in which a completer or exiter who had been placed in a job or a completer or exiter who had been continuing their education were both included in the earnings measurement. Now they're going to actually exclude students who complete and then enroll in an additional education program, recognizing that their wages may be a little bit deflated due to continuing education. Note that the placement requirement, the job placement requirement, students who continue on in their education still will be included in that and technically will not be considered placed if they are continuing their education. So a little bit of, two slightly different directions on the interpretation of the statute there. And the NPRM does go into, or excuse me, the final rules do go into detail on that decision making. The last two, these are really technical things. One is largely just an acknowledgement that there was sort of a technical error in the NPRM that said remedial and ESL coursework cannot count towards enrollment intensity. Basically, it was interpreted only in credit hour programs. They say that is still true for credit and clock hour programs, recognizing that a lot of Workforce Pell programs are clock hour. And then finally, something that just wasn't explicit in the NPRM, but is in the final rules, that this is voluntary. Institutions do not have to participate if they don't want to. To that end, on the timeline, July 1st is approaching, but if you can leave with any message today, it is that July 1 is an effective date. It is the starting line and not the finishing line. And so in most states, applications actually won't even be available to institutions by July 1. So don't panic if you haven't seen yours. Know that there is still, again, more work to be done. This is a starting line. With that, I am really excited to introduce today's panelists. So I will stop sharing and allow them to join me up here. First is Jess Kostelnik, Senior Policy Advisor for the Colorado Governor Jared Polis. We have Katie McClelland, Executive Director of the Governor's Workforce Board in Minnesota, and Whitney Thompson, Deputy Director of Workforce Education for the Illinois Community College System. Again, I have had the great pleasure of working with these three great leaders over the last couple of months. Please, if you have questions, drop them in the Q&A. But let's get it started. Let's kind of go down the line and tell me you're all right, representing different agencies here. And at a high level, how has your state actually approached planning for Workforce Pell? What was the process like and who was involved? Anyone want to go first?
I can hop in. Don't mean to leave you hanging, Annie. Um, in Colorado, we saw this initiative as requiring multiple different partners from multiple different agencies, just based off of how our state is structured. So, when determining who is going to kind of lead the planning process for Workforce Pell implementation, we ultimately decided that it was going to live within the governor's office. I'd like to give my colleague Rachel Snyder, who's on the call, a little shout out. We call her our credential czar, but she's been helping us coordinate across multiple state agencies, including our Department of Higher Education, our Department of Labor and Employment, and our community college system, as well as disseminating information out into our third party provider ecosystem, just that way they also have information. But we have really viewed this as the governor's imperative for project management and policy development, and then working with each of these different ecosystem partners to support the verification of required data elements or with the actual hard tech that we need for program review and upload. In Colorado, we also don't have a centralized program approval authority. And so we had to figure out the right both tools to do that review and approval and to kind of take disparate data sets from different state agencies for review. But we again needed kind of a neutral coordinating body, which was the governor's office, because we lacked that central program approval. And then the last piece of this is that the governor's office has been really putting forward an agenda of unification across our higher education, workforce development, employment services ecosystem in the last few years. And we saw Workforce Pell as both a forcing function and an opportunity for us to advance the conversation about integrated service delivery and kind of a unified ecosystem, because I think short-term credentials and non-degree credentials have really been where we've realized where there are gaps in our current infrastructure. So that was another reason why we wanted to make sure that the governor's office was really close with the product.
Awesome. So governor's office out front and leading. Whitney, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I like the credentials are too, Jess. Whitney Thompson, Community College Board for Illinois. So we have a two-pronged governance structure for Workforce Pell. One, we have a leadership team made up of directors from all the education and workforce agencies, the state workforce board chair, with leadership from the governor's office. They are definitely foremost leading this effort, and that group is the decision makers. We have an interagency steering committee made up of all these groups that are doing the day-to-day work and routing these policy decisions to the leadership team with generous policy support from ESG. A little shout out there. And we have close partnerships with all these agencies and stakeholders. The ICCB has sort of been taking a little bit of a leadership role in this work only because we know that the community college system in Illinois will probably have the most eligible programs. And so given that their breadth of programming and short-term credit and non-credit areas, we felt it was important for us to have a seat at the table and a driving seat at that. And so, I sit on our state workforce board. We have, it's been a Herculean effort to get close to the finish line. But it's been extremely collaborative. And our goal from the beginning is to expand access to these federal funds for students while maintaining those consumer protections. And I will be touching on that a little bit throughout today.
And when Whitney says ICCB has taken a little bit of a leadership role, she's being very modest because she has been a tremendous leader among the Illinois team. Yeah, Katie.
Great. Hi, and thank you so much for having me today. So in Minnesota, our state workforce board has been working very closely with the governor's office and their leadership on kind of helping us understand how we should be implementing and who we should be prioritizing to have at the table for this work. So similar to what Jess was saying in Colorado. And so right off the bat, we started partnering with our Office of Higher Education because they are the place that reviews, approves Title IV applications and other higher education reviews. And so this was a great opportunity and kind of a great forcing function because we are now working very closely with the team that we hadn't been before. And I think one of the things we realized right off the bat too was that it was going to be very important for us to establish a strong governance foundation for us all to understand the roles and responsibilities and who's doing what. And once we were able to do that with the Office of Higher Education, then we started bringing in even more partners. So more partners from the Department of Employment and Economic Development, where we have our labor market information team, and we brought in our sector partnership committee from the Governor's Workforce Development Board to have consultation along the way. And thanks to ESG, they helped us plan kind of a big stakeholder day or stakeholder engagement session where we had kind of something to respond to for all of our policies, but we really tried to take a collaborative approach of bringing a lot of partners to the table that included our CTE partners and community college presidents and other folks that, would be impacted by this work, our community college system too, which is separate from our Office of Higher Education in Minnesota. So there were a lot of partners at the table, then also making sure that we're bringing in registered apprenticeship partners too. And but throughout the whole thing, making sure that we were clear on that governance structure so that that's something that we could continue to point back to. And then we also made sure right from the beginning that we were being clear on what our goals are. And I think we'll talk about this in a little bit, but we decided from the outset that because of the tight timeline, we wanted to create a minimally viable product by July 1st. And so that's what we were targeting, but then also making sure that student consumer protections were one of the biggest things that we were thinking through with all of this so that, because Workforce Pell means that it's impacting a student's lifetime eligibility for Pell, we want to make sure that these programs are going to be something that help lead to the outcomes that are required, which based on the federal regs, it's completion to a job. And so having that be kind of a central part of all of our planning and making sure that that's good. We understand the governance and understand what the goals are for this program.
Yep. Yep. So, I mean, I think, you're hearing it from somebody in a governor's office, at a community college system, at a governor's workforce board in 3 different states. This is a new way for state agencies to work together, like for the most part. Of course, there are opportunities for alignment in vacuums, but this really has forced, I think it's important institutions walk away with like, agencies have been forced to move really, really quickly on this policy and are doing their best to meet all of what I laid out in the presentation at the top. And so keeping with this theme of like, there's a different flavor in different states, and each of you represent a different place. Each of you also, it's part of why I picked you, are taking quite a different approach to where program approval lives. Again, important for institutions to know it's not always going to be right necessarily your higher ed, your SHIO's office or the community college system. So talk to me a little bit more about why you chose the process for approval that you did based on your unique context. And maybe Whitney, I'll start with you, recognizing that you do represent a community college system here.
Sure. So, originally when we were having conversations around the process for approval, there was a conversation around, do we integrate this into our ETPL, the eligible training provider list process? But ultimately, it just didn't feel like it was a right fit for many reasons. And largely because we, as the community college board, have such strong relationships with our community colleges and already play a program approval role, similar to the Board of Higher Education in Illinois, which is the SHIO, obviously has great close relationships with the four-year institutions and other providers. And so we felt that because of that capacity and institutional knowledge regarding the curriculum pieces, it made sense for us to take lead in the approval process. Now, I will say that we have what we're calling an interagency review. And so that is made up of the Community College Board, the Board of Higher Ed, as well as the Department of Commerce, who will be specifically reviewing the employer validation documentation and evidence that is submitted by institutions for their Workforce Pell programs. And so as an interagency team, we will consensus on these recommendations for approval, and then it will move to our state workforce board, who will ultimately recommend approval to the governor's office. And so we felt that, one, to be in line with the statutory requirements, that there is a significant consultation with the state workforce board. And obviously the governor is the final accountable certifying entity, but ultimately us as higher education agencies that work day to day with these institutions on program quality, program approval, program review, felt that it made sense for the programs to at least start with us.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know we have heard in a couple of other states with community college systems that like the community college systems want to maintain, right, their authority of program review in some ways. So they're kind of batching, data or applications, again, can take a slightly different flavor. But, if you're an institution listening and are a part of a system, like obviously, I'm sure your system is communicating down to you, but keep that in mind. Jess or Katie?
I can jump in. I think this is a great example of how we are also looking at what other states are doing and adjusting accordingly. Because when we originally started, our plan was to just have our Office of Higher Education review the applications and make the decisions if they're meeting the eligibility criteria or not. But with more and more conversations, and I think one of the things that came up to what Whitney mentioned too is the employer validation piece. Like our Office of Higher Education started asking questions about how they could make sure that they were getting this right. And it felt like a lot of pressure just for them. And then when we saw some other states' policies come out and realized that they had review committees, we thought that was a good idea too. So we added that into our policy as well. So now we do have a review committee that includes the Office of Higher Education, the Department of Employment and Economic Development, our Department of Labor and Industry, which houses our state apprenticeship agencies, also included whenever there is relevant or whenever there are registered apprenticeship programs. We've got our state workforce board, and I'm sure I'm missing someone right off the top of my head, but we tried to kind of widen the circle of who's going to be looking at these to help make the recommendation to the governor's office so that it wasn't so much pressure just on one agency, especially since this is a new program and we're not really sure yet what success looks like or what this will look like. And then one other idea that we got to is from other states was providing a role for our local workforce boards too. So if right now we just have one list or one occupational list, and I think our hope for beyond the MVP is to have regionally specific lists as well. But because we don't have that right now with the tight time frame, we also provided the option for our local workforce boards to provide with the application their verification that this occupation is in demand in their region or in their local area, and that it should be approved for a Workforce Pell program as well. So that's another feature that we added from the time that our policy went from or public comment to when we finalized that.
Mm-hmm.
We definitely took an approach of, as I mentioned, Colorado doesn't have centralized program approval authority, so our institutions of higher education aren't submitting programs to our SHIO for review and approval. That was a really important component of how we made the decision to create the process that we did. So I know we'll probably get into the nuts and bolts here a little bit later in the conversation, but we're ultimately doing program review and approval through our ETPL. So I think one of the conditions we were trying to navigate was the lack of higher education program approval through our SHIO office, which is why we ended up on the ETPL. But then another component reason for that decision was because we need the data. And I think that something that people are talking about a lot on the implementer side are who has access to what data, and that wage outcome data was already an embedded function of our ETPL. And then in also thinking through who could access, wage data from other states through different interstate agreements. It seemed like our ETPL had the best shot, and some of those existing frameworks would allow us to get more of that information, so that way we'd have more data to then certify eligibility on the outcome side. So that is how we ended up on the ETPL. And then the third kind of component that I think, sorry, I'm amending as I'm speaking. The third component that definitely contributed to the decision around the ETPL is that it touched more provider types. And at the time that we were making this decision, I want to acknowledge that we didn't have the final regulations yet. So everyone was trying to build this plane as we were flying it and trying to make a best guess as to what the final regulations would look like. But really, no one could afford to wait for those to be final before we had a plan in action if we wanted to be able to open doors on July 1st. So we were building the plane as we were flying it. And with that in mind, we thought, where can we have a central touch point between private occupational schools, public institutions of higher education, and apprenticeship programs? And that's also where we decided to put our program approval through the eligible training provider list. So we're still working on the back end, who owns which parts of the product, to make sure that we can get the data flows working as they need to and by design. But there have been a lot of both administrative questions that we've had to navigate, as well as authority questions that we've had to navigate, like who ultimately gets to make these decisions.
Yeah,
Hope
I
that answers
appreciate
from Colorado's
it.
perspective.
Does, yeah, right. I mean, there's something really unique about the Colorado context. Most SHIO offices have program approval, at least program approval authority, but not all do. And so in the case of Colorado, that became a question about like, well, what has typically been done? How do we leverage those processes? And again, you see three different sort of interagency in Illinois. You have the ETPL and Workforce in Colorado, and then with the SHIO's office in Minnesota. And I'll also note, all of you mentioned we're still tweaking, like we're learning as we go. And again, like as an institution, keep that in mind. Like Illinois just finished up public comment. I think Colorado's policy is still out for public comment. There's only, I mentioned 12 policies are out there, but there's only a handful of which are actually finalized with applications out, Minnesota being one of them. So keep in mind that there's still room to help shape this. Let's get into the nuts and bolts a little bit more. So, one of the big strategic conversations that has been happening in all 8 of our states is around that priority occupations list. So, Jess, Colorado had a lot of back and forth on their list. What were some of the decisions you were grappling with about like what actually made that list, and how did you keep your institutions, the providers, in mind when you were making those decisions?
Yeah, I think this goes back to what our state was trying to achieve for Workforce Pell. And I want to acknowledge that Workforce Pell is a really ambitious policy from the feds, but it will not solve the challenge of kind of pipeline management and short-term non-degree credentials for states. It is just a framework for us to start to approach these issues. And when taking that perspective on deciding our priority occupations, we realized that we wanted the framework for Workforce Pell to extend beyond Workforce Pell itself and inform other areas of state policy in short-term credentials in high school, industry recognized certificates, for example. So with the understanding that we wanted these definitions to be used broadly, even if the standards for Workforce Pell were specific to that program, we decided to take a look at our existing state definitions. And in Colorado, we had the top jobs report. So that was jobs that satisfied a certain demand threshold and a certain wage threshold squished together in one list. And in doing that review, we realized that was probably too narrow for Workforce Pell implementation, and we needed to separate out these lists as high wage, in demand, high skill. We also had some circularity between our WIOA and Perkins state plans, where they were self-referential, but not definitional. And I don't know if anyone else has looked under the hood of like, what is the exact definition of high skill, high wage? But we found ours to be a little fuzzy around the edges, and that wasn't going to work for something that we needed to certify, either met a threshold or didn't. And so we really spent a lot of time trying to be sophisticated with coming up with definitions that could work in a K-12 setting, could work in a post-secondary setting, could be applicable in the future for our talent pipeline report, which is a really important report that we release on an annual basis that gave us some flexibility in framing so we could talk about low wage work that is also absolutely critical for community investment and community success, talking about high wage work that is maybe low skill. So we wanted flexibility in the definitions. We chose to define them all separately. And ultimately for Workforce Pell, we're asking occupations to satisfy 2 out of 3 of those definitions. And now that we have these definitions, we'll continue to apply them, but maybe with different levers as we go for different use cases.
I know the definitions pieces came up in at least Minnesota. I think we talked about it in Illinois too. I don't know if Katie or Whitney, you all have any follow-ups of just like, getting underneath the hood on some of this stuff.
Yeah, I can start. So, we are really excited to dig more into our definitions. That's going to be a next step beyond the MVP. But for the purposes of our minimally viable product, we decided to do an and with the high skill, high wage, and in demand industry sectors and occupations. So the in demand part was what we started with, and we have an occupations in demand tool at the Department of Employment and Economic Development that we used as kind of our starting point. And it has stars, five most in demand, one not in demand, and decided that it needed to be 4 or 5 stars to demonstrate that there was a strong demand for the occupation. And then the next step is being the high skill. So we decided to have this list has a number of filters, and we decided to apply a filter for um, some type of post-secondary credential that was not an associate's or bachelor's degree, because you cannot get an associate or bachelor's degree with Workforce Pell. So if the most common credential that is needed for the job, according to our list, is that, then it can also be on the list. And then for the high wage, we did go with family sustaining wage ranges for the occupations that have that range for family sustaining wages. So it got to a slightly narrow list. But then we also wanted to make sure that we know that there are some very in demand jobs in the state, like CNAs. And so, in thinking about how to make sure that included and prioritized, we also included our Drive for Five sectors. So in Minnesota, we've identified our top 5 sectors of priorities, which include caring professions, education, manufacturing, the trades, and tech. And so if it met the other requirements beyond the wage threshold, those occupations could also be included on our in-demand list. And I guess I'll talk in a minute too, just about how we're excited about the next stage of thinking about more alignment around definitions too.
Whitney, anything else to add?
I would just double click that we are similar to Minnesota, sort of approaching our priority occupation list similar to them in terms of utilizing our ETPL demand occupation training list, which again is informed by demand and has those filters for skill and education level. We definitely, similar to Minnesota, we're grappling with the occupations that are very much in demand, very much high skilled, but are right there on the wage threshold, and thinking about how do we prioritize those occupations that are very much in need but don't meet those wage thresholds. And that was a robust conversation, and ultimately we landed with that they are on the list, but that potentially we could be thinking about some additional evidence that institutions would need to provide to ensure that individuals are moving into sustainable wage careers.
Yeah.
Whitney, can I jump in and I'm thinking too about how all states are wrestling with this. And when we had a lot of pandemic era dollars, many states invested in short-term credentials. Colorado was one of them, and we put millions into training for a lot of our healthcare careers or our care careers, early childhood, public safety. And we didn't have a wage requirement, in part because we felt like the public investment was to try to right size the ROI for those occupations. And so I guess we're all wrestling with this, like, how do you talk about high wage and what is the role of public investment? And I'm jumping in, and Annie jumping a question, but I'm curious how you all are thinking about that yourself, because it's something we're wrestling with in Colorado.
Just you saying, like, how are we reflecting public investment in how we're thinking about this?
Well, I'm struck by Workforce Pell as one tool, but
Yeah.
the conversation that it's spurring is really around short-term credentials and how do we subsidize certain pathways. So I think, yeah.
I was
Jump
going to
in,
interpret it as
sorry.
like, is the state
Yeah.
role exclusively around quality control? We should only be prioritizing pathways that lead to high wage, or is it in right sizing a market that undervalues really important, dignified work? And I think, right, in an ideal world, those two, you're not making a choice between those things, but and in policy is a blunt instrument, so it's hard, I think, to have the nuance you might want.
And I'll just mention that again, like, past our MVP product, something that I'm really excited about and would welcome any state engagement from anyone else who's already got this figured out. But one of the things that we're thinking a lot about is how do we actually update what our formula is for this in-demand list? And how do we think critically about state investments that we're making, especially on the economic development side? Because once those funds are awarded, they typically come with some types of guarantee, promises of jobs that are going to be created. And I don't think that we're doing as an effective job as we could of getting that information down to our regional and local partners. And so that's something that we're really thinking about is how do we, this is kind of, it's an unfunded mandate that's spurring a lot of discussion and conversation, but it's something that we're thinking critically about in Minnesota is how do we make sure that we are getting everyone the information that is specific to their occupations, to their regions, about where demand is coming. And so I think that's something I'm really excited about for what comes next. And if there are other states that have already figured out how to crack that code and figured out what the right percentage for the formula is for your in-demand list that's based on economic development investments, that would be really helpful too, because, especially in this place of short-term credentials, because frequently it's going to say in 2 years, we need to hire this many technicians. And so let's make sure that we're trying to support. We've made state investments in this, so let's make sure that we're making sure our workforce system is responsive as well.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like of the like providers I've talked to, this idea of like, yeah, but in my community, it's like this, and the wages are like this, and the demand is over here. Like, how could we possibly have one approach? I'm curious, Whitney, like, I kind of want to stay on this thread of like, where can you go with Workforce Pell? Like, do you hear that from the colleges you're working with at ICCB?
Yeah, in terms of stackability, in terms of those additional pathways, and that, when we were having conversations around our definitions, Annie, you may remember our definition for high wage, which high wage is maybe not the right term here, but that is what is required. It was different than what was in our WEO estate plan. Our Perkins State Plan and WEO estate plan were different. And we had a definition that allowed for this sort of stepping stone, right? That this job was a stepping stone to that next level, and which speaks to the stackability requirement in Workforce Pell. And this conversation has bled into our conversations on credentials of value and what do we mean by value, and are we truly only speaking about monetary value, but what about social good, and what about job satisfaction and flexibility and all the other things that individuals are seeking when they're looking for a career. And so we are very much those two threads are starting to braid together as we're thinking about credentials of value and Workforce Pell.
Yeah, I mean, Katie, is there anything more? Like, again, I know you've been talking about this is the MVP, but where do we want to go next? You've already given us some highlights, but since we're on this thread of like, how do we use Workforce Pell as a forcing mechanism? Do you want to talk any more about where Minnesota's going?
Yeah, and this is what I'm actually excited about. And also shout out to ESG for helping us kind of plan this out. I think we had been thinking we need to do a lot more for those definition alignment pieces that I think Whitney and Jess have both mentioned. But there's just also some basic pieces that we're missing on alignment between WIOA and Perkins CTE. And I've mentioned before to you and other folks that I helped lead the reauthorization of the Perkins CTE law in 2017. And one of the big goals for that law was stronger alignment between WIOA and Perkins CTE, but we haven't seen that as intentionally as we would like. And I think that so we're thinking now, first we were thinking one day, now we're thinking we've got so much to cover that we're going to do a 2-day summit on this. So if anyone's from Minnesota on this webinar, let us know if you're interested. But I think day one is going to be all about like programmatic and definition alignment of where are the opportunities for us to align on definitions of high skill, high wage, in demand, but then also thinking about work-based learning. Can we get to alignment on a work-based learning framework that everyone could be starting to measure towards? And could we be thinking too, even about funding alignment and mapping of that? We haven't done a great job of mapping our local workforce development areas to where our Perkins CTE consortia are to help make sure that there's intentional coordination and collaboration there. And how do we make sure that if we want to be strategic and blending and braiding this funding and having people understand what dollar comes first and what dollar comes last. How do we do that in a meaningful way? So that's all going to be day one. And then day two is data, which is also very exciting, where again, thinking about this occupational alignment, how do we bring in economic development data? But also there's other data out there in the world too. Perkins CTE needs to have comprehensive local needs assessments, which we're not using to inform any of our in-demand or our WIOA lists right now. And then also, how do we make sure that we are trying to have our system be forward looking. A lot of LMI data right now is backwards looking to try to project what's happening in the future, but with AI and other things, how do we think more strategically about that? And then also, how are we making sure that we've got a strong data foundation for some of the upcoming requirements around enhanced wage records, or other pieces like that. So trying to make sure that we're all on the same page about the policy priorities and what data could look like to really improve our system. So that's what I'm really excited about.
I love it. And I'll tell you, I was talking to somebody who does a ton of work with institutions of that Minnesota's thinking about this idea of like using Workforce Pell to better align these different funding streams, right? We got HEA funding now and WIOA and Perkins. And they were like, oh my gosh, finally. So hopefully, finally states are doing something about, all these disparate streams that support short-term training, but do so in largely different silos. I'm curious if that sparks anything for Jess or Whitney on like, I mean, I know Whitney, you already mentioned like, look, it has us thinking about COV and it has us thinking about stackability differently. But Jess, is there anything else that kind of comes to mind for you?
It's triggering for me, this new question about what is the role of the financial aid officer and the public benefits manager. And I think we've started to think through who gets referred into a Workforce Pell program and where are they coming from? Because they might be getting referred to a Workforce Pell program through their community college, or they might be getting referred to a program through their private occupational school, or potentially just through the ETPL as a result of a touch with the public workforce system. It's Title IV funding. And to Katie's point, it will also get braided potentially with WIOA funding, and it might fall into a designed pathway that includes Perkins funding. And so I think there are rules around how the funding can be used and when it can be used sequentially, that I think are going to be important for financial aid officers to grapple with. But that coupled with state incentives around priority pathways and programs, I think that the role of the financial aid officer is greatly expanded now as a result of this, in order to manage with proficiency a Workforce Pell program. Students are going to be bringing in all these other funding streams to bear. And I know that that's very complicated, but I do think it's both a call for technical assistance from the U.S. Department of Education on how to lead some of this work. And it's a call for technical assistance from state CHIOs to really get into the weeds with financial aid officers and also unpack how these federal streams will interact with and complement existing state investments. So that was a trigger. I had some other thoughts, but they're wandering, so hopefully they'll come back.
Whitney, you guys have done at ICCB a ton of stakeholder engagement. I mean, I know to ISAC, which is the aid authority in Illinois, has also directly engaged aid officers. Like, how are you all thinking about supporting institutions through this process, recognizing that, to Jess's point, like a lot is being put on the plates of financial aid officers with this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was really important as we were building a policy that we always had a public comment period in mind, but that we were hoping that the policy that goes to that public comment period was well informed by people on the ground doing this work. So we worked with, as you said, our ISAC, which is our state aid agency, to you partnered with them to do a financial aid listening session. We've been meeting with different roles at the community colleges and the universities, the presidents, the chief academic officers, the student service officers, the non-credit side of the house, faculty, to ensure that they understand the requirements and can kind of prod at the policy drafts that we had provided to ensure that we were moving in line with our goal around expanding access and not having a significant administrative burden while meeting the requirements of the regulation, which could be conflicting. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's going to be a lot of work for institutions, and we're aware of that. And so, we plan to go live with our application July 15th, but we're going to build in some office hours, and we'll be sort of holding their hands along the way. I mean, obviously they have to meet all the requirements, but most of the challenges that they will have is around the documentation. And so making sure that they're understanding the type of evidence that they need to provide, but then we are also stepping in and collecting the student level data and matching it with the wage records, so that they don't have to provide that placement data. We're stepping in and collecting and doing that for our institutions.
Yeah, I want to get back to the reducing the burden. Speaking of type of evidence, people should go and check out Illinois' employer validation policy for Workforce Pell. But it strikes me as a place where like there may be need to be some new muscle that is built at the institutional level, potentially across the board, across the country. Whitney, talk to me a little bit about like what that policy looks like, what's going to be required of institutions, and maybe how are you preempting that support for that in some way.
Sure. So we are using really little attestations in our Workforce Pell approval process. And so when we got to employer validation, and that's probably the one that had the most robust discussion, not only in our stakeholder meetings, but on our interagency team, we are requiring sort of three sets of evidence. One, for meeting the hiring needs of employers, it's sort of a second check on demand and thinking about, because our demand occupation training list is for the state, right? And so they're sort of providing that demand for the geographic scope of the program through job posting data or at least three employer letters. Two, in providing evidence for the alignment of the competencies between the program and the occupation, and for that we are requiring documentation such as competency maps, job descriptions, or meeting minutes from their local CTE advisory committees, sort of documenting that the competencies of the program are aligned to the competencies of that occupation. And a letter from an employer stating that we've hired from the program, we're satisfied with graduates from the program, and we plan to hire more students in the future. And so this letter was really important for two reasons. One, to meet the overall requirements of the statute, not because a letter is required, but we felt that we really need to make sure that there was direct input from employers, and you could sort of side skirt that if you wanted to by just submitting the job posting data and maybe some meeting minutes or a competency map. And so um, if a program doesn't have an employer that they partner closely with and isn't willing to commit to hiring, then is it a quality program? So it really speaks to the quality control mechanism, which advances our goal around consumer protections. I will note that initially our policy did not include that, but we met with an employer focus group who pushed us to ensure that employers had a strong voice in this process. And so we feel like, again, it meets the requirements of employer validation, but also is a really good check for consumer protection, ensuring that employers are hiring from these programs that we're utilizing federal dollars for. And
Well, and
so,
to that end,
yep, go ahead.
I was going to say to that end on consumer protection, it's also if you're going to meet a 70% placement rate, like yeah,
Yeah,
you better have an employer lined up who's ready
yeah.
to hire from this program. And so while it may seem like a high bar on top of an already high bar, the reality is to meet those outcome metrics, it's probably a good practice. And again, leveraging Workforce Pell to encourage that at your institutions doesn't hurt. Jess or Katie, is there anything from your policies of like evidence that you're like, oh, it's steep, but we know that it's important to be done for quality, for eligibility?
Yeah, I'll chime in just on the on Whitney's comments on the three or more employers. That is something that we had questions about too, of like, oh, are there other ways? Are there other associations or other people that could validate this instead? And I think we kind of stuck firm on the three or more employers, and we have just a one-page letter demonstrating that they do meet hiring demands or that they have some kind of engagement with students they either plan to hire from, they have hired recently, they're providing work-based learning opportunities, some kind of employer connection, and then also the validation on the curriculum, either curriculum review that they're donating equipments, materials, supplies to that program, and making sure that there are at least three employers that can do that because the only successful outcome of this program is employment. And so if you don't have three employers that can tell you, yes, we're doing those couple of things, then I don't know that we're setting the student up for success. And if that's kind of our, North Star for the program, I think that's a really important part to us. But one other thing that we do have a checkbox that says other. So we're hoping if there's other ways that employers are engaging that we haven't thought of, we're hoping to collect that because that could also help inform kind of future iterations of what this policy could look like.
I'll jump in because Colorado took kind of a different approach on employer engagement. I think our bar is a lot less rigorous, and we do accept a letter of support, for example, from an industry training association or some sort of industry association generally, because we're really trying to start forcing some of those talent conversations into the industry association space rather than being an individual business burden. We also heard a lot from our employer community that we're not asking the right questions of employers. Like, a letter of support is one way that they can be helpful, but they're not monolithic, and asking them to perform administrative or bureaucratic functions to say that something is right is maybe not the highest and best use of their time. And so we try to be really sensitive to that. I am really impressed by the folks who have secured hiring or interview commitments out of their programs. I think that is like a gold standard that we'd be interested in the future. But I think right now our approach has been like 70% job placement rate. You're working with employers. Like, you have, like, that in and of itself tells us that you have a very, very high rate of success. 70% completion within 150% of times, like, that is a very, very high rate of success. And so we thought that the numbers bore out the proof point maybe better than the anecdotal components that were also being requested in the verification process. And that's where we're indexing for this first year. I know that we'll iterate, and it's helpful to hear from my colleagues what they're saying those quality benchmarks are. But I think our initial data scan, not looking at people who have applied to the program, suggests that only 6 programs will be eligible. And so I think when we were also balancing the risk of, is this going to be a consumer protection issue, or are we already setting such a high quality bar that so few programs will register? We erred on the side of the quality standards are really, really rigorous already. So how do we actually test out whether or not this works, and we can constrain further? But we felt that it was already pretty adequately constrained for year one.
Yeah. Fair. Well, and you've named the elephant in the room. And before we jump into how many programs are really going to be eligible, just to note, like, if you all have a question for the panelists, please throw it in the Q&A. We've only got about 8 minutes left here, but I know that the 4 of us could talk forever. All right, we know not a lot of programs are going to be eligible right this year. How should colleges be thinking about maximizing this opportunity, even if they don't have a program that is eligible right now?
I'll jump in to say, Annie, I think this is a forcing function for so many other conversations that we've been meaning to have for so long. So credentials of value, we're talking about that. The Lumina Foundation is leading work related to that. Workforce Pell, I think, has had a very reciprocal relationship with that project, trying to inform, like, well, what should the standard be? If 70% is a really aggressive cutoff for a lot of programs, should we be negotiating? Is like 60% appropriate? Like, what is appropriate at what time horizon? I think it's raised all these threshold questions that we haven't actually addressed for how to talk about quality. And it's also asking us to build the infrastructure to attest that quality. And I will say, once it's built, it will be used. So even if it's not used to the same threshold as Workforce Pell, once it's built, we'll have a way of assessing the threshold. And then policymakers in individual states can decide what that bar is. So I don't think it's going away. I don't know that Workforce Pell makes sense for every institution, but I think it's a way of us targeting investments for short-term credentials and talking about what states care about with a lot more specificity. And so I guess my advice would be, plan as if you're interested in it, even if you never really are, because I do think it's starting to shape the way that the federal government and states think about what they'll invest in.
Yeah, I'll just pull on that thread a little bit. I mean, I think, if institutions think that Workforce Pell isn't worth the squeeze, so to speak, I do think that overall accountability framework, thinking about value-added earnings, is a signal to the type of accountability measures that future initiatives or grants will have embedded in them. So they really shouldn't ignore this and should try to embrace it. I mean, I think, for the community colleges, when this first came about, thinking about 70% completion within 150% of time, we're open access institutions, students come in, come out, but we're hoping that isn't an excuse, and that institutions are really thinking about how they can provide ample wraparound academic and non-academic support to individuals using Workforce Pell as one of those tools to get students to completion. And so, I think it's a real opportunity to be thinking about our overall pathway work and ensuring that we have these documented connections, not only within the institution, but with other institutions, non-credit to credit, as we think about stackability and articulation. So I think overall system, right, it's provided us some pause to think through where we could potentially pull some levers.
And I think the only thing that I'll add, I think all of the points that Jess and Whitney just made are really good ones. And especially we've heard some challenges with data and data quality from some of our institutions too. And I think that they're very clear signals about direction that things are moving. And so it is good to think now critically about what data do you have to meet these federal requirements, or if you don't have the data, what support do you need to get your data systems up to speed to get there, and letting your related system understand that, but also having feedback to the Governor's Workforce Development Board or your other other organizations in your states that can help make recommendations about funding opportunities or try to find opportunities for strengthening data infrastructure. And the other thing I would say is that, we've mentioned, so I think a lot of us have mentioned that there's constant tweaks that we're trying to make to the state level requirements. And anytime that you make a change to your programs, that restarts the clock, from my understanding, of how long your program has been in place. So I think right now is maybe an interesting time to be changing elements of your program. Be careful about if you're changing them to your state areas of focus or state areas of flexibility, because that may be continuously evolving. So just as you have interest, be sure to engage. I think all of us have demonstrated that we're really interested in engaging with stakeholders as part of this process. So be sure to try to engage to see kind of where states are moving. And also for those federal requirements, we don't see federal laws change very often. So try to get in alignment with the federal requirements, especially around some of those data pieces.
And Katie, just to piggyback, and I think I'm seeing some chatter in the chat that I just want to raise and acknowledge.
Yeah.
This is challenge by choice. So it's a big undertaking, but no one's going to compel you to apply for Workforce Pell. We do think it sounds like we all agree that investing in data systems updates is a good thing. But also preparing registrars' offices, preparing financial aid officers, I don't think in Colorado that will be an issue for some time. By the time we open up our approval process, approve the programs, review and approve the programs that we have, then submit the list to the Secretary of State's office, we lose all control and visibility into how long that process will take. So I think given the changes over at the U.S. Department of Education, I have capacity questions myself. So I don't know when we can expect funding to actually flow and that final list of programs to be certified. It may not be anything that you grapple with fall of 2027. It may not be anything you grapple with until fall of 2028. So I guess there's still time to figure it out, even though technically the gates open July 1, and that just feels worth flagging.
I just want to reiterate a couple of really important points. One is writing is on the wall with this level of accountability. And so, whether we like it or not, it's here to stay most likely, and we may see it showing up in different places moving forward. And so starting to orient yourself to be able, whether it's on the data side or the program side, be able to respond is going to be important. I also think Katie and Jess both made a great point about you need, if you're going to change the length in particular, make those changes now so that you can be eligible in a year. And yes, we don't yet know, I think, when the funds will actually flow and when institutions will be able to originate them from the department, because we're not entirely clear on how long it will take the department to do their own approvals. I know Gary asked some questions in the chat. I think he was asking for clarification, Jess, on the number that you estimate is going to be eligible. I don't know if Whitney or Katie, you have that number off the top of your head too. All right, we only have a minute left. So let's just maybe rapid fire here. What is one lesson learned and a takeaway for the crowd here, the college leaders who have joined us on this call? And then we will respectfully head out. Whitney, you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think one, we would have loved more time and probably built in stakeholder engagement from the very beginning. We were still grappling with the requirements and I think having some local folks on our advisory committee early on would have been helpful. But again, hindsight.
Yeah. Jess or Katie?
I'll say that we're still figuring it out, and as soon as we have it figured out, we'll have new things that we have to implement, like occupational code alignment requirements. So we won't be done figuring this out. It won't be settled for 5+ years. And for first movers who are interested in this, we ask that you be implementation partners and help us work through these friction points because we are not going to know what they are until we get there.
And I'll just echo the call to work with us, express your interest in working with us. And there's now requirements that we make this policy, or we include this policy in our WEO estate plans that have to happen every 4 years and then relook at them every 2 years. So this is going to be an ongoing process, and it'll likely be one of the more live policies for every state. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities to engage, and please keep doing that and telling us what you're hearing, what you're learning. There's places that we have flexibility and there's not, but we want to work together.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for the great conversation and for Steve setting the stage for us to work with his members. Thank you.
Yes, thanks to everyone. And just a reminder, we will be sending out the recording shortly in the next few days. So thank you to all the panelists. You guys, fantastic job, great information, and I know our members appreciate it. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.